So usually when we talk about reaching 100 years old, there's this heavy expectation of extreme biological purity, right? Like engineering a perfect machine.
Right, like you eat your green vegetables, you run
Yeah,
marathons.
exactly. You meticulously avoid anything even remotely toxic. And the doctor points at your chart and says, well, there it is, perfect health. But then you look at the actual historical record of the world's oldest people, and suddenly that pristine image is completely shattered. Take a French woman named Jeanne Calment.
Oh, her story is fascinating.
It's wild. When she passed away on August 4, 1997, she was 122 years and 164 days old. That makes her probably the oldest woman in recorded history. And you'd think she lived like a monk, but her daily routine was just baffling.
Yeah, it really defies all conventional medical advice.
Right. So she woke up at 6:45 every morning, did a long prayer, put on some headphones, and did chair exercises. Yeah. Which is fairly standard. But for lunch, she refused healthy fish, preferring heavily spiced or fried foods. She ate 2 pounds of chocolate every single week.
2 pounds of chocolate a week.
Every week. She was absolutely punctual about going to bed at 10 p.m.
Yeah.
Oh, and one more thing. She smoked cigarettes every day for 100 years.
Yeah.
A literal century of smoking.
She is the absolute definition of a biological paradox. It forces us to question everything we assume about cause and effect in human health. And, she wasn't entirely alone in this either.
Wait, really?
Yeah, Christian Mortensen from Denmark became the second oldest man in the world at 115 years and 252 days old, and he was also known to indulge in a cigar from time to time.
That is just incredible. Well, welcome to this deep dive into the Nova Daily Genetics series. Today we are exploring the work of Dr. Daniel Wallerstorfer from his book, Unlock Your Genes for Precision Health.
It's a great book. Really breaks down the cellular reality of these things.
It really does. So our mission for you today is to uncover the exact genetic mechanisms behind detoxification and addiction. We're going fundamentally into the cells to explore why some people can survive deadly habits for a century while others tragically cannot. Because to be clear, surviving 100 years of smoking just shouldn't be biologically possible when you look at the raw numbers. The math on the damage is brutal.
The statistics are staggering, honestly. A single cigarette contains over 4,000 chemicals, and we know that at least 250 of them are explicitly harmful to human health. Researchers estimate that every single cigarette you smoke reduces your lifespan by an average of 11 minutes.
Let me do the math on that real quick. So for a pack-a-day smoker, you are losing an average of 1.5 days of life for every single pack you finish. Over a year, that adds up to losing 2 whole months of your life. Just gone.
Just wiped out, yeah. And we have to look beyond just the length of life to the severe diseases that dominate those final years. Smokers are 4 times more likely to suffer from cardiovascular disease.
4 times. Wow.
They are 13 times more likely to get lung disease, and they are a massive 23 times more likely to develop lung cancer compared to non-smokers. It represents a public health catastrophe.
23 times more likely is just, it's hard to even wrap your head around that risk.
It is. In the United Kingdom alone, smoking is responsible for about 120,000 deaths a year. But the most sobering detail of that statistic is that 50% of those smokers are middle-aged when they die.
It's like they're playing biological Russian roulette.
Ugh.
I mean, to put that into perspective, for a young non-smoker today, you have about a 70% chance of living to 80. If you pick up that smoking habit, that probability drops dramatically to just 35%.
Exactly. It gets cut right in half.
So this brings us right back to the central mystery. If the statistics are that grim, how did Jeanne Calment's gun never fire?
Yeah.
How do you process toxic smoke for 100 years without your cells mutating into cancer?
Well, genetics provides the blueprint for that survival. It brings us down to the cellular reality of detoxification. To understand the mechanism, we first have to isolate what exactly is in that smoke causing the severe damage. We're looking at a group of compounds called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAH.
Okay, so when we talk about toxic smoke, what is the actual chemical culprit within those PAH doing the heavy lifting?
Benzoapyrene is the most well-researched example. It's been documented as a severe carcinogen for decades. You don't just find it in tobacco smoke. It's present in coal, in ash, and even in burnt food.
Oh, like when you char something on the grill.
Exactly right. But the biological reality of benzoapyrene is far more counterintuitive than most people realize. In their normal resting form as they float in the smoke, these PAH aren't actually carcinogenic yet.
Wait, what? They aren't carcinogenic yet?
No, they are incredibly toxic, certainly, but they do not possess the ability to directly mutate your cells and cause cancer in that raw state.
Wait, so if the raw smoke itself isn't immediately mutating the cell, how does it become so dangerous?
This is the crazy part. Our own body's defense mechanisms actually create the threat.
You're kidding.
No, seriously. When these pHs enter the body, they are immediately intercepted by two specific detoxification genes, CYP1A1 and the very similar CYP1B1. Their designated job is to break down the pAHs in the first critical step of the detoxification process.
Okay, that sounds like a good thing, though.
It is, but the breakdown process itself alters the chemical structure, creating an intermediate product that is highly carcinogenic.
So the body's own detox process is what actually creates the cancer-causing substance. That sounds like a terrible evolutionary design flaw.
It really does seem that way, right? But it's an unavoidable biochemical stepping stone. The body absolutely has to convert the pAH into this carcinogenic intermediate state before other downstream genes can swoop in and break that down.
Okay, so they break that down into progressively less harmful substances.
Yes, exactly, until the threat is completely neutralized and flushed from the system.
Okay, so the system works ideally if everything flows at the right pace. But I understand there is a massive paradox with how these CYP1A1 and CYP1B1 genes operate in some people. Like a gene defect, but not in the traditional sense where a gene is broken and just sits there doing nothing.
Right, the defective versions of these genes are actually supercharged. They are wildly overmotivated.
Overmotivated genes.
Yeah, the moment they recognize the pAH entering the system, they attack them aggressively, converting them into those carcinogenic intermediate substances at an incredibly rapid pace.
So a defective gene here actually works way too hard. I'm picturing an assembly line. The first worker, let's call him the CYP1A1 gene, is frantically throwing parts at the second worker way too fast.
That's a perfect way to visualize it.
So the second worker can't possibly keep up. The parts pile up on the conveyor belt, the system crashes, and the factory basically catches fire.
That is the exact mechanism happening at the cellular level. The subsequent detoxification genes simply cannot keep up with the sheer volume of carcinogenic material being produced by that supercharged first worker.
And what happens to all those piled up carcinogens?
Because they accumulate and just sit there in the tissue, they remain in the body long enough to physically bind to and damage the DNA. They cause literal writing errors in your genetic code when the cell tries to copy itself.
And those writing errors are what lead to the tumor.
Exactly. Those typos in the DNA sequence eventually disable crucial cancer-preventing genes. Once that specific anti-cancer protection is lost, a cell begins to divide uncontrollably and grows into a tumor.
That is terrifying.
It is a brutal biological chain reaction, and it's why 85% of lung cancer patients die within 5 years of their initial diagnosis.
But then you have Jean Calment. Her assembly line didn't catch fire.
Right. She almost certainly possessed the favorable variants. We call them the leisurely CYP1A1 and CYP1B1 genes. They take their absolute time.
So they don't rush the assembly line.
Exactly. They issue the command to produce the carcinogenic intermediates slowly and steadily. This methodical pace allows the subsequent detoxification genes to work effectively, rendering the substances completely harmless before they have any opportunity to damage the DNA.
Wow.
Yeah, people walking around with these favorable, slow-paced genes are about 9 times less likely to develop lung cancer than people with the overactive supercharged genes.
9 times less likely. That is a massive difference in risk. But let me push back here. If I get my DNA tested and find out I have these leisurely assembly line genes, does that mean I can safely take up a chain-smoking habit? Am I magically in the clear?
Dr. Wallerstorfer is incredibly firm on this point. Absolutely not. Smoking is never healthy for anyone, regardless of their DNA.
Good to know.
Yeah, Jean Calment didn't survive a century of smoking just because she had leisurely detox genes. She likely possessed a multitude of other highly protective genetic variants across her entire genome, buffering her against the cardiovascular and respiratory damage.
So it's a huge combination of lucky genes.
Precisely. If a chain smoker ever tells you their habit is fine because their neighbor lived to be 90 while smoking a pack a day, you can now explain the exact highly improbable genetic lottery they are banking on. Statistically, it will not end well for them.
So even with great detox genes, smoking is physically destroying you, which naturally begs the question, right? If we know the raw statistics and we know it's a game of genetic Russian roulette, why is it so incredibly difficult to just put the cigarette down?
It's the ultimate question.
Right, people know it's killing them. This brings us from lung detoxification directly into brain chemistry. Let's unpack the actual mechanics of addiction.
Addiction requires the chemicals in the smoke to essentially hijack the brain's baseline hardware. To visualize how this happens, imagine a single nerve cell inside your brain. It has about 10,000 microscopic arms reaching out toward other brain cells in the immediate vicinity.
10,000 arms, just on one single cell. That is crazy.
It is dense, but crucially, none of these 10,000 arms ever actually physically touch the neighboring cells. There is always a tiny microscopic gap between them.
So if there is no physical connection,
Mm.
how do they pass a signal? Like if I'm feeling a sudden burst of joy or focus or a good mood, how does that electrical impulse get across the gap to the next cell?
They use chemical messengers called neurotransmitters. The electrical signal travels down the arm all the way to the edge of the gap. The cell then releases these neurotransmitters into the empty space.
Okay, so they float across.
Yes, and the neighboring receiving cell has specialized receptors on its surface that act exactly like distinct locks. If the neurotransmitter is the perfectly shaped key, it docks into the lock, turns it, and the electrical signal continues on its journey to the next cell.
Got it. And the specific neurotransmitter involved in the smoking response is acetylcholine, right? How does that specific key function?
Acetylcholine is heavily responsible for transmitting signals related to memory, arousal, attention, and your overall mood.
So when you are feeling sharp and content, acetylcholine is successfully bridging those microscopic gaps.
Precisely. And here is the dirty trick of nicotine. Nicotine chemically mimics the shape of acetylcholine.
Right, so it just impersonates the natural chemical.
It is a chemical masterclass in deception. Nicotine enters the brain from the bloodstream and docks right into those exact same acetylcholine receptors. It completely bypasses the brain's natural system.
Oh,
You no longer need a neighboring cell to organically send a good mood signal. The nicotine just forces the lock open itself. The smoker feels deeply satisfied and hyper-attentive seconds after that first puff because the drug is triggering an artificial impulse that didn't naturally exist in the brain at that moment.
but the brain is an incredibly sophisticated organ.
Right.
It doesn't just passively let an outside chemical flood its receptors and run the show forever without putting up a fight. It wants to maintain its baseline. And there's a fascinating concept here from the book called the happiness baseline.
Oh yeah, it is a foundational concept for understanding human behavior and addiction. The brain is constantly working to maintain an emotional and chemical balance.
Like a thermostat.
Exactly. To prove how powerful this thermostat is, researchers conducted a profound study looking at two vastly different groups of people. They looked at people who had just won the lottery, and they looked at people who had recently become paralyzed as a result of serious accidents.
You literally couldn't pick two more extreme opposite life events.
Yeah.
Ultimate financial freedom versus a devastating physical trauma.
Right, and the initial emotional spikes were exactly what you would predict. The lottery winners were experiencing an incredible euphoric high, and the accident victims were utterly devastated.
Makes total sense.
But the profound discovery came when the researchers checked back in with both groups just a few months later.
Both groups recalibrated right. They returned to their normal pre-event baseline of happiness.
They did. The lottery winners, despite all their new millions, felt no happier on a daily basis than they did before buying the winning ticket.
That is so wild to think about.
It took slightly longer for the accident victims to process the trauma, but eventually they too returned to the same level of baseline happiness or unhappiness they had before their accidents. The brain actively regulates itself. It calibrates its receptor hardware to ensure you aren't perpetually euphoric or perpetually devastated. You return to your center.
Okay, so if the brain acts like a thermostat, constantly adjusting the temperature to maintain this baseline mood, how does it react when a smoker artificially floods the system with nicotine?
The thermostat kicks in aggressively. The brain recognizes that there is way too much stimulation happening at the acetylcholine receptors. So the receiving brain cells physically alter their structure. They literally reduce the number of receptors they produce. They board up the wind vanes, basically.
Wow. So now that massive artificial good mood signal from the cigarette isn't making you euphoric anymore because there are fewer locks to open, the nicotine is just bringing you up to a normal baseline. You don't feel better, you just feel normal.
Exactly. And when you try to quit, when you remove the artificial nicotine flood, suddenly you have very few receptors available, and your natural organic acetylcholine signals are nowhere near strong enough or plentiful enough to activate the few remaining locks.
Oh, that sounds awful.
It is. The result is a crushing physical lack of natural good mood signals. You feel awful, irritable, and unfocused. That biological deficit is withdrawal.
Okay, well, that definitely explains the mechanics of withdrawal. But if I compare two different people, why is it that one person gets hooked instantly after a few puffs behind the school gym, and another person can smoke casually at a party and just walk away the next morning without a second thought?
Because that acetylcholine receptor on the receiving brain cell isn't just a single, simple metal lock. It's constructed more like a highly complex Lego set built out of more than 10 different three-dimensional blocks.
Oh, okay.
And every single one of those Lego blocks is produced by a different specific gene. And the exact shape of those genetic blocks varies wildly from person to person.
So if my receptor is built differently than yours,
Yeah.
how does that actually change the way my brain physically reacts to that first puff?
The variations alter how the key turns the lock. Let's look at the beta-3 gene. Depending on which variant of the beta-3 block you inherit, the physical structure of your receptor shifts slightly.
And what does that shift do?
That structural change determines the exact electrical signal sent when nicotine hits, which dictates how dizzy you get when you smoke your very first cigarette.
Oh, that's fascinating. And then we have the alpha-5 gene block. How does that alter the physical experience?
The alpha-5 block tweaks how deeply the nicotine key fits into the overall receptor structure. This determines the actual strength of the feeling of happiness you get from that first cigarette.
Oh, so directly controls the reward.
Exactly. Because it dictates the reward, the alpha-5 gene heavily influences the age at which you start smoking, and crucially, it actively increases the risk of addiction in young smokers.
There's also the beta-4 gene mentioned in the book, which influences the age someone starts smoking as well.
Right. And finally, you have the alpha-3 gene block. When you combine the specific structural effects of your beta-3, your alpha-5, and your alpha-3 genes, you have a highly customized genetic combination.
And that combination decides your fate, basically.
Pretty much. That specific combination dictates your overall probability of becoming dependent and precisely how brutally difficult the withdrawal process will be for you when you try to quit.
Let me stop and really highlight this because it completely changes how we view each other. When a friend boasts that they can smoke 3 cigarettes at a bachelor party and not touch them again for months, society usually tells us that person has supreme willpower and moral character.
Oh, absolutely. We judge it very harshly.
But what we're saying is that it's literally just their beta-3, alpha-3, and alpha-5 genes doing the heavy lifting. Their biological lock just doesn't trap the key the same way.
We attach so much moral weight to addiction. We label it a lack of discipline. We judge people harshly. But the reality is that the casual smoker's biological hardware simply doesn't reward them with the same intense euphoria or trap them in the same severe withdrawal deficit as someone born with a highly susceptible genetic blueprint.
It's just biology. Well, if addiction and human behavior are so deeply dictated by genes and receptors, we have to zoom out and look at the ultimate reward chemical in the brain. We have to talk about dopamine. Because there is one master regulator gene that seems to dictate how we experience life on a much broader scale.
If you want to understand human behavior, stress, resilience, and addiction, you have to understand the COMT gene. This gene produces an enzyme whose primary biological job is to break down and clear away dopamine from the brain's synapses.
And dopamine is the great excitatory neurotransmitter. It drives our thinking ability, our motivation, our coordination. It's the chemical that makes us want to seek out rewards, right?
Right. Humans broadly fall into 2 distinct categories based on how their specific COMT gene operates. About 85% of people possess what we call a fast COMT gene.
Fast, meaning their enzyme clears the dopamine out of the gap very quickly. So if you are listening to this right now and you are someone who thrives under tight deadlines, you handle chaos well, but you rarely feel a massive lingering rush of euphoria when you succeed, you are likely in that 85%.
Yes, because they break down dopamine so efficiently, they generally have much less dopamine lingering in their brain at any given time. This lower baseline makes them incredibly resilient.
They just bounce back?
Yeah, they handle high-stress situations very well. They are less physically sensitive to pain, and because they simply don't experience massive lingering dopamine kicks from rewards, they are significantly less prone to gambling or alcohol addiction.
But there is a downside, right?
There is. On the flip side, they're also generally documented as being less curious.
Okay, but then there's the other 15%. The people with the slow COMT gene? What is happening in their brains?
These individuals have a gene that produces an enzyme that breaks down dopamine very, very slowly. As a result, their brains are constantly flooded with additional lingering dopamine.
It sounds like living life in vivid high-definition dopamine. Every victory must feel incredible. But if you had that slow COMT gene, it sounds like you are practically hardwired to be more vulnerable to everything from alcohol to burnout simply because your brain physically holds onto the reward signal too long.
It is the ultimate biological double-edged sword. Positive experiences for the slow COMT group are incredibly pleasurable. They possess pronounced memory and attention capacities, and they are highly curious.
Which makes them explore more.
Right, exactly, which unfortunately makes them much more prone to try drugs in the first place. But what happens if they get into a highly stressful situation? The body naturally releases a spike of dopamine to deal with the stress.
And they already have high dopamine.
Right. Piled on top of their already high baseline, that extra dopamine completely overwhelms their system. They're highly sensitive to stress and pain, and they carry a major risk for burnout syndrome. And because they experience the dopamine reward of a drug so intensely, they are highly susceptible to addiction. They literally enjoy the chemical high more than the 85% of people with the FAST gene.
And this genetic divergence has devastating real-world consequences. There's a specific risk regarding teenagers' cannabis and the COMT gene that completely floored me when I read it.
Scientific studies have tracked teenagers who use cannabis before the age of 16. If a teenager happens to have two slow COMT genes and they use cannabis early, they have an average risk of developing schizophrenia later in life.
An average risk, so just standard baseline danger.
However, if a teenager has the genetic disposition of two fast COMT genes, the ones who usually handle stress better and are normally less prone to addiction, and they use cannabis before age 16, they have an up to 11-fold higher probability of developing schizophrenia later in life.
11-fold. That is an absolutely devastating consequence for long-term cognitive health, and it is entirely dependent on which microscopic version of a single gene you happen to possess. What is a mild baseline risk for one teenager is a life-altering permanent danger for another.
It perfectly illustrates why precision health is not just a buzzword. We cannot treat human biology as a one-size-fits-all machine. The reactions are all quietly orchestrated by the individual variations in our DNA.
We have covered incredible ground in this deep dive. We started with a 122-year-old woman surviving a century-long smoking habit through sheer genetic luck. We examined the hazardous assembly line of the CYP1A1 and CYP1B1 detox genes, where working too fast creates the very carcinogens that cause writing errors in our DNA.
Such a dangerous mechanism.
We explored how the physical shape of our acetylcholine Lego blocks dictates whether nicotine brings us joy or dizziness, and how the brain boards up its own windows to defend its happiness baseline. And finally, we looked at the dopamine-flooded reality of the COMT gene, where the speed at which you clear a chemical dictates whether you are prone to burnout, immune to addiction, or at severe risk from teenage cannabis use.
The science really reframes how we must view human frailty and human resilience. It's not just about the choices you make. It is heavily about the invisible machinery processing those choices.
So I want to leave you with a new lens through which to view human behavior. The next time you find yourself judging someone, or frankly judging yourself for a bad habit, a perceived lack of willpower, or an intense, overwhelming reaction to stress, remember the hidden genetic machinery quietly pulling the levers in the background. Take a look at your own habits and ask yourself, what are your genes trying to tell you? Because underneath the expectation of that perfectly engineered, pristine machine, there was a murky, deeply complex genetic landscape running the show. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.